My name is Mike Kofahl. I'm a staff lawyer at East Coast Environmental Law, and I work a lot on marine and coastal law issues. So, figured for Coastal Appreciation Week, we would do a little presentation on coastal protection law and policy in Atlantic Canada and what that looks like, and some of the work that we're doing, and some of the work that governments and others are doing. So let's get right into it. So I want to, before we get too deep, I want to talk a little bit about the land and also the water and the sky that we of the region, the region that we work in. Um, and I'm sorry, there's something blocking my view of most of it. There we go. So East Coast Environmental Law does our work throughout Atlantic Canada, so the four Atlantic Canadian provinces. And we work on the unceded and the unsurrendered territories of various Indigenous nations, including the Inuit, the Innu, the Mi'kmaq, the Passamaquoddy, the Wolastoqey, and historically the Beothuk. Today, I'm going to get only into a piece of the law that is applicable, and really a small piece of it, which is the Crown law aspect, which I'm a practicing lawyer of mostly Crown law, colonial law. But I do want to recognize that there is a long, long history of Indigenous nations practicing their own law and practicing that law under legal systems that have existed here since time immemorial. And I wouldn't have time, I don't have the expertise to speak to that, but I want to make space for it and recognize it, and sort of challenge myself and others to think about ways that we can intersect those two pieces, the Crown law and the Indigenous law. I myself work on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq and Unama'ki, also known as Cape Breton. And I'm going to be sharing some images. I have some photographs that I've taken from all four of the Atlantic provinces. So as part of the coastal appreciation work, I thought I would actually share some of those images of places that I really adore and that I've had a chance to visit. So just a quick introduction to our organization. East Coast Environmental Law is a nonprofit environmental law charity. We envision a future where laws and legal systems, including those Indigenous legal systems, protect ecological health and promote environmental and climate justice throughout this region. And our mission, our work, is to advocate for progressive environmental laws and policies throughout the region, to provide legal education and resources for free, and to share our legal skills with people who are working to prevent or address environmental harms. And you can learn more about our organization on our website. And we have two really great things on our website. Our resource library has lots of different short summaries and longer reports and research reports and all kinds of different resources about environmental law topics. And then we also have an environmental law inquiry service where people of the public in the region can actually ask us public interest environmental law questions, and ask for assistance with things. So I would check that out. This is not a very lengthy overview. I'm going to be chatting about our coastal law and policy work, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned from other jurisdictions and what's going on right now in the region for coastal protection law and policy. So I wanted to start by going over some terms. And these are two of the terms I'll be chatting a little bit about. The first one is actually a really important term and thing to think about. So I have already mentioned coastal protection, or I might mention coastal stewardship or coastal management a lot, and I'm going to talk a lot about the coast. And it's really important to get a sense of what we're talking about when we say we're working on the coast, or we're talking about coastal laws. So this is a picture of kind of the very far reaches or the corner of Chignecto Bay. This is from the New Brunswick side where the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia border is. And if you look at this picture, there's actually not, most of the picture is not coast. Most of the picture is land. You see there's obviously farmland there. And so it might be realistic to ask, or reasonable to ask, well, why is this photo in a presentation of coastal law and policy. Is this coastal land? Is this not coastal land? And that's a really important question because often coastal law, coastal policy really starts with that question. Are we on the coast? Where does the coast start and end? And who has responsibilities, who has rights in that space? So typically when I'm talking about the coast, the kind of my starting point is the foreshore area. And by that, I really mean the kind of area between the high water mark and the low water mark. So the high water mark is the point along the coast over time where on average the tide is reaching at its highest point, and the low water mark is the opposite of that. So over time, on average, where is the tide coming down the lowest? But the coast doesn't end at those 2 points. Often it is also the kind of adjacent space on either side. So the reaches above the high water mark, the sand dune systems, into the terrestrial space, and then that marine space as well, below the water, the area where it's always submerged, where there's always water. So the eelgrass meadows and down into further into the ocean. And so this is a really dynamic space. It's all constantly changing. The tides are changing. The sediments move along the coast. Things are eroding. And so that's kind of that dynamic space that we're talking about. And depending on where we are or what kind of issue we're dealing with, the coast or our definition or view of the coast might actually change. And the other thing I just wanted to highlight is that I will occasionally be talking about coastal access. It's really just a shorthand for public coastal access, and it's referring to the ability of members of the public, individuals, to access the coast, so to actually get to the coast, and then also their ability to move along the coast. So why coastal protection? Why the focus on coastal protection, or why the focus on coast? Why do we need, or why are we talking about coastal protection and not just environmental law more generally? And there's lots of reasons for this, but I think it's a recognition of climate change. It's a recognition that our environments, our communities on the coast, our coastal ecosystems, they're changing, and they're changing rapidly because of climate change. We have more severe storms that are creating higher storm surge. We have warming ocean temperatures that are causing sea levels to rise. We already have natural erosion on the coast, and some of those forces are exacerbating that coastal erosion or exacerbating that coastal flooding that can occur. And so this is a response to that, an ability or a response to climate change and a recognition that we need to adapt to that. So the organization has been working on coastal issues for as long as it's existed, but a lot of the work started to crystallize around 2017, 2018, when the province of Nova Scotia decided that it was going to move forward and create a Coastal Protection Act, actual legislation dedicated to the coast, something more comprehensive than what we have typically seen in Canada. And one of the first questions that came to our mind and was pretty important in the mind of the Department of Environment for the province at that time and for coastal communities and other organizations was, well, what does that mean? What is a Coastal Protection Act? We don't have anything like that in Canada, so are there lessons to be learned? And so we did a jurisdictional review, something that lawyers like to do a lot. What are other people doing? What does a Coastal Protection Act actually mean? And so we looked at a whole bunch of jurisdictions in Canada. What are the Atlantic provinces doing right now? What is BC doing? What is Quebec doing? And we looked at some international jurisdictions. We looked at the United States, some of the individual states. We looked at Australia, the UK, and New Zealand, just to get a sense of what are other common law, English-speaking jurisdictions doing on the coast. The province did end up passing, the legislature did end up passing the Coastal Protection Act, although it is still not in force. And you'll see here that the purpose of that act is to prevent development and activities that damage the environment by interfering with the natural dynamic shifting nature of the coast. So getting at the idea that we have to recognize that the coast is not set in stone, it's constantly changing and moving. So are we doing things that damage the environment and interfere with those natural processes? And it's to protect the coast and prevent people and infrastructure buildings from being at risk of sea level rise, flooding, storm surges, erosion, especially those kind of natural processes that are exacerbated by climate change. And so the objective of our coastal work and some of our projects has really been to contribute to that law and policy to protect the coastal ecosystems and communities that live there from inappropriate development, and also to ensure equitable public coastal access. So we've been doing a coastal law project for the last little bit over a year now, and it's really been it's kind of had four key outcomes. The first is an update to our jurisdictional review that we did back in 2018. The second is a new state of coastal law and policy for Atlantic Canada, identifying some of the opportunities and challenges in the region, and then applying our research and the lessons we've learned to try to inform some of the law and policy development in the region, and just do public education about that work, about the laws, about the policies. And I'm going to be sharing some of that today during this webinar. So we do have an updated report that is complete. It was released last August, almost a year ago. You can check that out. It's on our website. You can also, I'm going to give it a moment, that QR code is live to the report, so you can just use your camera and go right to that report on your phone. But I'm going to be sharing some of the lessons from that report during this presentation. So the objective of that report review was to say, okay, well, since 2018, have there been changes? Are people doing things differently? Have people revised their approach? Have they refined it? And the answer is really no. And that's a good thing in the sense, or that's a kind of a neutral thing in terms of international jurisdictions, and it's maybe a poor reflection of where we are so far in the region. So the central focus in jurisdictions outside of Canada continues to be, okay, well, we want to make sure that we're not developing in places that might be inappropriate or unsafe, and managing risks from things like flooding and erosion. But there are continued refinements and new approaches to doing some of this. There's been more and continued mapping and refined mapping, more detailed mapping of coastlines using LiDAR and other technologies. There's been enhanced and renewed climate change strategies and planning, and a greater focus on shoreline management plans. So a shoreline management plan is essentially kind of a recognition that the coastline is not homogeneous, and so we want to deal with localized risks or differences along the coast. And so we would split up the coast or divide it into segments or divide it into manageable chunks and plan for those areas. So a focus on shoreline management planning that kind of incorporates high-level policy into more local action. And there's also been an enhanced focus on nature-based solutions. We've known for a long time, I'm probably for decades now, that building walls on the coast, dumping rocks into the ocean and building rock walls is not very effective. It's not sustainable. It's quite expensive. And often over the short term and medium term, and the long term, it can actually make things worse. It can accelerate erosion. It can worsen flooding. It can damage adjacent properties and deflect damage onto people's property where they may not have faced that otherwise. And it can damage ecosystems. It can damage salt marshes and dune systems that protect us. So if you're dumping rock and then you're destroying those habitats, it's actually worsening the erosion or worsening those floods or those not protecting us against that storm surge. So there's been this recognition, and now it's emerging in the law and in the policy that we need to think more seriously and strategically about when we're building those hardened structures and when we're protecting the natural ecosystems to protect us, or using sort of more nature-based solutions to doing some of the things we want to do, which is protect communities. The best practice overall hasn't really changed since 2018. I mean, the kind of central thing that we have identified again and again is that we need a dedicated, integrated, and coordinated approach to coastal protection and management. We can't do it in a piecemeal fashion. It just doesn't work, and other jurisdictions aren't doing that. And the ones that have been doing it the longest have the most coordinated system in place. And some of the features of that include an overarching plan or strategy that establishes policy objectives that are then implemented at a more local level. Clearly delineated coastal zones. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's quite important to identify what is the coast, where are we actually working, what is the priority. And many of the jurisdictions we looked at, all of the ones internationally, have a clearly delineated coastal zone or clear definitions for what is the coast and where are we putting our effort. Also, best practice enforceable rules, something that is legally binding and usually, in many, 99% of the cases, minimum horizontal setbacks. So how far back is it safe? And a building elevation. So, for example, if you're building half a kilometer away from the coast, but you're under sea level and there's a storm surge, you're at a pretty good risk of being flooded out or having your building swept away or someone getting hurt. So that building elevation recognizes the sea level rise and some of the other risks that come along with living along the coast. Another best practice is a dedicated body, having an agency or a board or department actually doing the coastal protection, doing the coastal management. One of the things we hear quite regularly from people is that they're facing an issue. Maybe it's infilling or a rock wall, or there's an activity or a project, and they don't know who to go to. They don't know who's responsible. For example, in Nova Scotia, we have legislation like the Environment Act that can apply to the coast, and it's the Department of Environment that's responsible, the Minister of Environment. Or we have aquaculture legislation, and that's the Fisheries and Aquaculture Department. And we have Crown law permitting and approvals that have to go through the Department of Natural Resources. And there might be municipal laws or bylaws implicated, or there might be a federal role. So it can be really overwhelming and really difficult sometimes to parse out who's actually responsible or who's taking the lead. And a best practice is actually having someone or a dedicated body or coordinator to go to as a starting, at least as a starting point. And then there's a very clear focus on three kind of core areas. So development, coastal development, coastal ecosystems, and coastal access. And I'll talk a little bit about those. So the focus for coastal development is usually regulating coastal development or associated activities. An essential focus is some of these things like infilling, armoring, construction. But it's not always just about prohibiting or preventing development on the coast. Sometimes it's just about planning for development. So you might actually want to encourage development on the coast if you're you have a working harbor, you have wharf infrastructure, you have activities like aquaculture or fish plants that actually are best suited to be on the coast. So planning for those too. It's not just always about prohibiting people, but it's really just about smart planning and making sure that the places we do build and do encourage people to go to is a safe place and doesn't destroy habitat or ecosystems that are really important. Another focus is often on coastal ecosystems on the terrestrial side. So often there's protections, general or specific, for coastal wetlands, so like salt marshes, beaches, sand dune systems. And there tends to be less of a focus on the ocean side of the coast, so the things like eelgrass beds, fish and fish habitat along the coast, or even seabirds. And this is kind of a gap that we found in all of the jurisdictions that were reviewed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's less important. Because the things we do on the terrestrial side of things do impact those. if we have a septic system runoff or we have stormwater runoff that goes into the coast, that can affect these things. And so I think thinking about a little bit more about how we deal with the coast holistically is one of the things that was a gap in what we found, and something that we might want to think about addressing. And finally, coastal access is quite important and protected in many areas. And in fact, places like California and the UK do a fantastic job of not only talking about coastal access and the importance, but not only protecting the access points that exist currently, but actually facilitating more access points. And access might just be giving people a route to get to the coast and move along. It might mean building infrastructure. It might mean building washrooms or designating parking areas. So there's all kinds of different ways of not only just protecting it, but enhancing it. And coastal access is quite important for people if they need to get to coastal resources. If you think about Canada, Indigenous nations, Indigenous communities have been using coastal resources since before anyone can remember. Accessing the coast can be really important for restoration projects, and not just terrestrial restoration, but marine restoration as well. So thinking about eelgrass restoration as an example. Coastal access is really important for connection. So when you feel connected to the coast, when you feel connected to the place that we live, you can go there, you can play in the water, you can go swimming, you can launch your kayak or go surfing. That creates a sense of community and connection. That's really important because then that connection strengthens our bond to that place or those places, and facilitates greater, I think, stewardship of those places. If you can't get to the coast, if you're in the city and you can't access those coastlines or those beaches or those salt marshes, it's going to be harder to feel any kind of sense of duty to them. And access is important for monitoring enforcement. It's not only important for enforcement officers or someone from the government to go and actually see if things are doing well, but it's also important for individuals in the public, community members, organizations to go out there and see what's going on, to monitor the change that's going on, and to contribute to that enforcement. So there's lots of different tools and approaches ultimately to coastal protection, coastal management, coastal stewardship, and there's no right combination or single best tool or approach. Often comes down to local implementation, and even in places like in California or New Zealand, where there's a very strong overarching coastal law or coastal policy with clear high-level objectives. Ultimately, the way that local authorities or regional authorities go about that is very different, even in adjacent jurisdictions. So some of the tools here are permitting and regimes and approvals. So identifying a coastal region, a coastal area, a coastal zone, and applying additional or stringent rules to help protect communities or ecosystems. Land use planning is really important, and I mentioned shoreline management plans as an example. Sometimes they also have more specific beach management plans, like in North Carolina, in South Carolina. Sometimes you can have zoning or overlays. So you might identify an area of the coast where it's really important to protect that area, but then you may have an overlay where, okay, well, part of this coast that we want to protect is actually a working waterfront, and we want to have special rules that apply there. And maybe somewhere else on the coast, we want to apply more stringent rules where you can't go because it's a really important beach or a really important salt marsh. You can also do site assessments for projects, sort of akin to or related to an environmental assessment, or you could do an environment assessment. You can have performance-based standards. So rather than saying you can build there or you can't build there or you have to build so far back, you can have standards that say, well, you can build there if you can meet these outputs. If you can have certain standards that you're going to be able to meet, then yes, you can build there. Another really important feature of many, many jurisdictions is progress reporting, monitoring, and some sort of iterative loop, feedback loop, where you identify something and then you're tracking progress. You're identifying, okay, what is the priority now? How are things working? And sometimes things don't work out. And so how are you changing and how are you adapting to that? Some places like New Zealand actually embed indigenous laws or legal principles into crown laws and policy, or even make space for co-governance arrangements. And yeah, you can have dedicated public access areas like parks or trails or infrastructure. And a tool that's used in most places that have been doing this for a while is just education. Um, it's never ending. There's always going to be, the next politician or the next municipal councilor or the next organization or youth that are going into young adults that are buying coastal land that need to understand the importance of that. And when you get community and regional level buy-in, some of these things start to get easier. This table is a modified version of a table and there's multiple versions of these tables in the jurisdictional review. You're seeing a lot of red because red means that we don't have a dedicated coastal law or a dedicated kind of long-term plan or policy or strategy dealing with the coast. For the most part, the provinces in this region aren't doing a great job of coordination of various coastal issues, although that is changing slowly. And I'm not going to get into all of this, but red means there's not a lot. But there is progress. So, for example, in Prince Edward Island, there was a State of the Coast report that was commissioned by the government of Prince Edward Island and released in, I believe, December 2023. And it came along with a set of recommendations which the province completely agreed to meeting. So there was a number of recommendations, for example, developing shoreline management plans all the way along the coast and developing a beach access policy. And the province said, yes, we're going to do all of those things. And they have been working towards that. One of the priority areas there has been shoreline management plans, and they're piloting several of those SMPs in the future. And they're working on those pilot plans now. In New Brunswick, they are working right now on a draft State of the Coast report. There's already been feedback since last summer into that State of the Coast report, and that was interesting because it started out as a government initiative to deal with just coastal erosion. And there was so much feedback and sharing of ideas about we need to do more than just deal with erosion. We need to deal with it more comprehensively. And the province actually moved to something more comprehensive. And our understanding is that they're planning to have a full action plan dealing with many of the different aspects of coastal protection, coastal management, and not just dealing with erosion. And the first piece to that will be the State of the Coast report. And we're expecting public comment on that full draft report sometime this year and perhaps during the summer. And there's also an ongoing review of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is the legislation that, for example, deals with wetland alteration permitting or approvals and watercourse alteration permitting and approvals. And it's basically the way that the coastal areas protection policy of that province is implemented. And so there's an opportunity right now through that initiative, through that work, to perhaps get some of those protections not out of the policy and into legislation and strengthen that. In Nova Scotia, we have the Coastal Protection Act. It was passed with all-party support. I believe it was 2019. And although it's not implemented in law, there's been a ton of work. It's kind of there's been momentum for that, and it's never really completely been lost. There were regulations under that act that were being developed, and there's lots of good work that's been done by municipalities and by departments and by government and by organizations to move that file ahead. And so there is this basis of work that we have, even if the act itself is not yet proclaimed. And we have municipal bylaws. The municipality of the District of Lunenburg has a coastal protection regulation or bylaw. Other jurisdictions, other municipalities have started to think about how do we deal with coastal protection. So the work hasn't stopped, it's still ongoing, and there has been progress. Maybe it's not as fast as we would like to see it, but there's definitely been progress, and it's been noticeable in the last couple of years. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not been challenges, that there's not gaps. So some of the things we've identified in the region is just, I mean, this is probably coming out already, but the absence of a provincial law or provincial laws ultimately creates some uncertainty. It can potentially add costs to, especially the long-term management of our coasts, and it does create enforcement challenges. In part because we still have a very piecemeal approach to regulating and managing our coasts under the law. There's also a lack of coordination between different jurisdictions, and it's not just within jurisdictions, it's also between jurisdictions. So thinking about a lack of coordination between indigenous governments, communities, the provinces. There's multiple provinces, some of which are connected at the coast, like New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Lack of coordination between these different governments and municipalities, and there's been kind of I would say, a clear lack of a clear federal role as well. There's not a ton of federal land in Atlantic Canada. Often it's kind of small pockets of land. The kind of port and harbor infrastructural land, military land, or federal reserves. But there's still a role for the federal government. And especially if we think about the coast as being something more than just the foreshore, but being those two adjacent areas. And the federal government clearly has a role when it comes to the marine space because they have jurisdiction in that space. And then the other, I would say, key challenge is just not enough public awareness and understanding about why these coastal ecosystems that we constantly think about and are in, why they're so important, and why there's a need for coastal law and policy. And then one of the other things we noticed in terms of some of the gaps in legislation that kind of applies to the coast is that we don't do a great job of thinking about birds when we're building on the coast. You know, um, uh, you might have a situation where something might be good for one species of bird and detrimental to another type of bird. So thinking about how do we deal with those different things. And birds typically aren't on the radar when it comes to like permitting or approvals or assessments. Another gap is archaeology. So people have been living, indigenous nations, indigenous communities, indigenous peoples have been living in this area, in this region for a very long time. And some of their communities used to be on land and now are archaeological remains that are in submerged lands, but they're still in the coastal sphere. So thinking about how do we identify those important sites as we're doing the permitting. Another gap is often this idea of restoration work and how do we differentiate the need for faster permitting for restoration work that can have a positive impact and that can actually address some of the consequences of poor coastal law and policy, and how do we differentiate that from permitting for, say, a rock wall or a development on the coast. And often what happens is the permitting is the exact same. So you might have a somewhat stringent process to build a rock wall, but that same permitting process applies to restoration work. And sometimes that can have detrimental consequences. And then obviously I've mentioned this before, it's just the lack of focus on the marine coastal ecosystems. It's often the terrestrial and the foreshore that the focus is on. But that doesn't mean there's not also opportunities. I do think there is a ton of momentum and that continues to grow in terms of doing better on coastal protection law and policy in Atlantic Canada. So there's been ongoing education and there's an opportunity for people to keep learning about why these places are important and why the law is important. There's opportunities to embed Indigenous law into Crown laws, into bylaws, into policies, and find a path forward where we have co-governance. There's lots of opportunity for municipalities and for communities to take a leadership role. We don't have to leave it up to a province or a single government. We can all take an active role in doing some of these things by asking questions, by engaging in things like coastal appreciation week webinars and reading resources and sharing them. So there's a role for everyone to play, and there is a lot of, I think, positive support for moving along with coastal law and policy. There's opportunities for regional cooperation and collaboration. For example, if you look at a single municipality or a rural municipality, by themselves, they may not have the resources or the capacity or prioritize coastal protection. But together, working in partnership, you can achieve those things. And so I would just say there's a lot of momentum. And so I think it's just up to us to keep that momentum alive. And that is the end of the presentation. I've pulled out some of the resources that we have on our website. For example, our jurisdictional review. We have some summary series resources. We call them summary series on environmental law for the coast, kind of a general summary resource, as well as some volumes related to coastal access specifically. And then we have some other resources that you can check out.